Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to another episode of Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want to paint stunning tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. In this series, we'll show you how to save money on your miniature painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. So whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, you'll learn how to achieve incredible results without the premium price tag. And on today's video, we're going to show you guys how to paint up a squad of Gravewraith Stalkers for your games of Warhammer Age of Sigmar, or for your games of Warhammer Underworlds. As you can see, this is the end result of our miniatures brought to a wonderful tabletop standard, and by using the materials as well as the techniques that we suggest in this video, you're going to spend only a grand total of $22.61 to achieve this incredible result, at the same time saving you $97.74 when compared to products from Army Painter as well as Citadel. So that being said, let's go on and talk about how to paint up your squad of Gravewraith Stalkers for your games of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. So as you can see, the first thing you have to do is to assemble your miniatures, and the nice thing about Gravewraith Stalkers, at least the kit that I got anyways, they're actually push fit miniatures, so they're actually very easy to assemble. All you gotta do is cut them out of the screw, just kind of push them together, the friction kind of keeps them together, and once you get them put to their bases, the next thing you have to do, of course, is to prime your miniatures. Now, priming is a very important step in miniature painting because what it does, it gives a surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. Unfortunately, if you were to take just acrylic paint and apply it to bare plastic, the slightest bit of friction would cause the paint to rub off your miniature, which absolutely ruin the finish. So priming kind of prevents that from happening. The second thing that priming also does too is that depending on the color that you're priming miniatures with, it have a large impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you have on your paint scheme. Traditionally speaking, the brighter the paint scheme, you want to go with a brighter or lighter colored primer, while more subdued or darker color scheme, you want to go with a darker primer. Now we're going to do an ethereal paint job on these miniatures, so we're going to use a flat white primer by Rust-Oleum paint that you get at your local Walmart. We're going to use that as our basis, so that way when we apply our layers of color on these miniatures, it creates a nice ethereal kind of glowing look with these miniatures. Alright, so what we're going to do in order to achieve this ethereal glowing effect on our miniatures, we're going to use glazing as the primary way of doing this. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with what glazing is when you take paint and you water it down to about a 50-50 mixture. What you're doing is you're diluting the pigment of the paint, so that way when you apply it kind of like a wash over the miniature, the undercoat, which in this case is white, kind of bleeds through the successive layers of glaze that you put on top of it. What this does, of course, it makes the white kind of bleed through your painting, and at the same time also makes it extremely brightly colored as well, makes it look like it kind of glows. So in order to achieve that effect, we're going to use glazing, and specifically use Dutch Aqua by Folk Art in order to achieve this. So I take my Folk Art, Dutch Aqua, which I get at my local Walmart. I do a 50-50 mixture of this paint with some water, and then I apply it like a wash all over the entirety of the miniature. And I'm going to put 3 to 4 layers of this glaze all over the miniatures that I want to actually have this glowing effect attached to it. Now the thing about glazing, of course, is that you have to be very patient when you do glazing, because you have to wait for each layer of glaze to dry completely before you apply the next coat. So if you have other projects to work on during this time period, you can work on those while you let this dry. So we're going to put 3 coats of glaze directly all over the miniature. So the next step, of course, is to apply some more colors to add some more visual interest to these miniatures. So I'm going to use holly branch or apple barrel paint. I'm once again going to use a glaze, but this time I'm going to use it for the underrobes of these Gravewraith Stalkers. As you can see, they have like this kind of overhood that kind of covers their back as well as part of their faces, but they have like this underhood beneath it. And to create that color differentiation, I'm going to glaze that lower part of their robes with holly branch paint. Once again, we're doing exactly the same kind of glazing technique that we did before. We're using 3 different layers of paint in order to achieve this effect. Now, originally, this was the only step I was going to do with the glazing process on these miniatures. However, though, I didn't like the lighter color of the teal that I have on the top coat. I wanted something a little bit more subdued and darker, so because I'm going to add another layer of glazing on top of that, this time I'm using a darker color to achieve that effect. So to create even more visual interest, what I decided to use is Tuscan Teal by Apple Barrel paint. I once again do a 50-50 mixture of this paint as well as with water, and I apply it like a glaze directly on top of the part that I did earlier in Dutch Aqua. And as you can see, it has a very cool kind of glowing kind of teal effect as well. A little bit of that Dutch Aqua is bleeding through the Tuscan Teal, adds a lot of color variety, makes it like these guys are kind of like shimmering and ethereal, and it looks absolutely creepy, and I love it. So once we let this dry, of course, the next thing we gotta do is a quick dry brush. So dry brushing is an important step in miniature painting because what it does, it creates the illusion of death by adding highlights to your miniature. When you do dry brushing, the pigments of the paint actually adhere to the raised surface of the miniature while the darker colors stay in the recesses. Now to add a little bit of definition and to some 3-dimensionality to our miniatures, we're going to dry brush these guys real quick in some pale gray by Folk Art. You can get it at your local Walmart. And we're just going to do a very light dusting of this gray directly all over the miniatures that we did in glazing earlier, so that way we can create those details and create those that look of depth. As you can see, the darker colors, like in the robes, for example, are some of the recesses, and we highlighted some of the raised surfaces of the miniature to kind of create this kind of more of a three-dimensional look for these guys. Now, when it comes to your dry brushing, you can bring this up to whatever level of brightness that you desire. However, though, I suggest that you start with a very light coat of dry brushing when you first start out, because it's very easy to add successive layers of dry brushing on top of your miniatures, but it's very difficult to go back. In fact, you got to start all over again if you apply too much dry brush. So just put a light dry brush over the parts that you want highlighted. Ready to move on to our next detail. And that next detail is apply a one single layer glaze of pigment paint by Appleboro paint on all the top coat that we did earlier. So as you can see, we have like this glowing green, kind of teal, kind of white, kind of going through the glaze there. In this situation, I only put one thin layer of glaze directly on top of it because pigment paint is very opaque. So as you can see, that creates this kind of Grim Reaper look that we're trying to achieve when we actually put these miniatures together. So just do one quick glaze layer of pigment paint and you're ready to move on. And the next detail we're going to work on real fast is on the bases of the miniatures. So these miniatures are actually quite cool because they have a lot of sculpture on the bases. They have things like wrought iron fencing, they have pieces of masonry, they got plants, all kinds of really cool things on these bases. So to bring out those details, we're just actually going to put one thin coat of pigment paint directly on the bases. Now you might be thinking, Commander Cheapskate, why only one thin coat? The reason why is because I didn't want to drown out the details with too many layers of pigment paint, because I want to bring out those details. And besides, we're going to dry brush these bases with some pale gray anyway, so any white undercoat that kind of goes through the initial layering that we did, it's just going to add to the dry brush effect. And speaking of which, we're going to dry brush the base real fast with some pale gray. As you can see, it brings a lot of those details that we couldn't see before, so that we can see things like headstones, for example. We can see plants, we can see ironwork, we can see all kinds of neat details. And now that we got done dry brushing those so that way we can see them now, we're going to start painting up the details on these miniatures. So the first major detail we're going to work on is all of the wood, as well as the roots and the plants that are existing on the bases, as well as the handles of the glaives. Now the reason why we're doing this is because I want to make it look like that these ethereal creatures are actually picking up like inanimate objects on the battlefield and actually using them as weapons against their enemies. Like the blades themselves are very physical, while they themselves are ethereal. At least that's the look I was trying to go for anyways. So to bring out those details on the bases as well as the handles of their glaives, we're using two thin coats of burnt umber by Appleboro paint. You can get this at your local Walmart. It's extremely cheap to use. Just put two thin coats directly on those details and ready to move on to our dry brushing. And the color we're going to use for our dry brush is Territorial Beige by Appleboro paint. It's a wonderful kind of opaque brown color that I like to use for all of the dry brushing that we do in browns in our studios collection. So I just do a real quick dry brushing directly on the handles of the glaives as well as the bases where they're actually like tree roots and bits of plant life on the bases. The next detail we're going to paint are the bone elements on these miniatures as well. So things like the horses' skulls that represent the fates of the Gravewraiths. Also the bits of spines of bone that are sticking out of their top of their cloaks as well as any skulls that happen to be in the bases. We're just going to pick that on two thin layers of khaki paint. This is another color that you can once again purchase at your local Walmart for about 58 cents. We're going to put two thin layers of this khaki paint to bring out those bone elements, and we're ready to move on to the rest of the details. And those details we're going to paint are some of the flowers that are on these bases. As weird as it may sound, there's a lot of petals as well as leaves on these bases, as well as blossoms as well. So I want to make these guys look like they match up with the Thorns of the Briar Queen warband that I did earlier this month when I did my cheap shot videos. And the reason why is because I plan on using these Gravewraith Stalkers as part of a undead warband in an upcoming Mordheim campaign. And when I did those Thorn of the Briar Queen warband, I did a lot of these like magenta kind of flowers to contrast everything that we have going on, and to make these guys look like they match with that warband, I decided to continue on with that same detail. So we're going to use bright magenta of Appleboro paint. We're going to pick out all the little leaves as well as petals, as well as flowers that are on the bases of the miniatures, as well as on the gravestones. We're then going to highlight that detail just a little bit more by adding a slight dry brushing of some Cameo Pink by Appleboro paint as well. It's a beautiful powder pink color that you can get at your local Walmart for about 58 cents. We're going to do a quick dry brushing on all the petals and on the flowers and the blossoms that are on these miniatures, and ready to move on with our metallic elements. And luckily for us, there isn't much metal on these miniatures, so in order to bring out that detail, we're going to use Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art. We're going to primarily focus this with two thin coats on the blades of the glaives, which are, of course, the most prominent part of these miniatures, as well as the wrought iron fencing that are actually on the bases as well. We're going to look for those metallic elements. We're going to pick those out with two thin coats of Gunmetal Gray. And now that we're done with that, the next thing we're going to do is an oil wash. So the last step of our painting process is to do an oil wash. Now when people do an oil wash, they like to use Army Painter Strong Tone, which is perfectly fine because it's a wonderful product that does exactly as advertised. The only problem though is it is quite expensive, so I like to use Midwax Poly Shades and Mission Oak instead, because you get this stuff at your local Walmart for about $7.99. Now when we do the oil washing, usually whenever I do this step, I paint the entirety of the miniature with the oil washing, but we're not going to do that this time around because we want to preserve that ethereal look that we actually have on these miniatures. So to preserve that look, we're not going to paint this on the ethereal parts of the miniature. Instead, we're going to do things like the glaives that these characters are carrying, the bone elements on these characters, as well as their bases as well. Now this oil wash is going to do a couple of things. The first thing it's going to do, of course, it's going to seep directly into the recesses of the miniature and bring out a lot of those details we couldn't see before. So for example, if you look at the horse's skulls, for example, you can see the gaps in the bone, the individual joints in their teeth, their eye sockets. It also does a beautiful job bringing out all those textural details on the bases as well. So that's the primary thing that it does. The second thing that it also does too is it smooths out the transition between our dry brushes as well as our base coating. So as you can see, a lot of the pastel kind of chalky appearance that the miniatures had got smoothed out between those transitions because of the oil wash. And the last thing that it also does too is it also darkens down the value of the colors as well. That's the reason why we're not applying it directly on the ethereal part, because we want that to be like a glowing, sinister look, and that oil wash is going to make that too dark. So we're going to focus on those other details instead while leaving that ethereal look alone. Now you do have to wait for this stuff to dry and cure for about 24 hours, so make this the very last step of your painting process, and then return back to it the next day when you pick up your painting again. So 24 hours have come and went in this photo, so what we're going to now do is focus on the rim of the bases. And for this, I like to use English Ivy Green by Apple Paint. And it's a beautiful dark olive drab color that I use for all the undead miniatures in the studio's collection, whether it be for Warhammer or for Warhammer Fantasy. We're just going to put 2 thin coats of this along the rim of the bases, and the last step is completely optional. And that last step is to put a matte varnish spray on the miniatures. I like to have a matte varnish finish on my miniatures when I get done painting them because the polyacrylic will actually make them have a high gloss sheen. Now, if you do like that high gloss look instead, you can completely skip this step, but I like a matte finish. So because I usually use Krylon matte varnish spray, I just give the once over the entirety of the miniature to protect the paint job, and we are fully complete. And here we are. Here is a beautiful end result of our cheapskate method, only costing us $22.61, and that's assuming, of course, you're purchasing everything on our list for the very first time. You can see we brought these guys to a beautiful tabletop standard, and they're ready to rock and roll on the battlefields of the Realm Gate Wars, or in the ruins of Warhammer Underworlds, or like the way I'm going to use it, I'm going to be using them for Mordheim and the City of the Damned. So now that we're done talking about our miniatures and how we paint these up using our cheapskate method, let's talk about exactly the materials you need to buy from both Army Painter as well as Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using those name brand paints instead. Alright, so this is the shopping list you need to get from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using those name brand paints instead. You need to buy a can of Corax White Spray for $24, as well as the colors Thunderhawk Blue, Vulcan Green, Fulgrim Pink, Caliban Green, Screamer Pink, Morghast Bone, Baylor Brown, Eshin Gray, and Ulthuan Gray, and each of those pots would cost you $4.55 a piece. You also need to buy the colors Wildwood, Leadbelcher, and Aethermatic Blue, and each of those cost $7.80 on top of that. You also need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone, which is going to run you $32 for that as well. So assuming that you're purchasing everything for the very first time on this list, you're talking about a grand total investment of $120.33 to paint up your Gravewraith Stalkers the same way we did, but using the name brand paints instead. When you subtract that from the cheapskate total of $22.61, you end up with a grand total savings of $97.74. So, in conclusion, if you're looking for a way to save money on the miniatures wargaming hobby and you end up painting your miniatures, may I suggest switching to cheaper craft paints instead. After all, you could achieve similar results at a fraction of the price and have really stunning looking miniatures that you can use in your games. So that's good for you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. I am Commander Cheapskate. I will catch you guys in the next video. Peace out and stay classy.